You may have seen a story from the New York Times recently. It caused a bunch of protests. It caused a bunch of opinion pieces popping up where they're claiming the Trump administration is trying to define gender based on your genitals. This story is entirely confusing. It might actually be fake news. My understanding of what the New York Times published is that it is factually 100% incorrect, misleading, and it's causing problems within the social justice movement and in politics right now. I don't know why the New York Times did this. The problem is that the New York Times is conflating gender and biological sex, okay? And for the sake of argument and fairness, we have recognized that gender originated as a term to refer to social aspects of someone's biological sex, not their biological sex. A lot of people who are on the right don't understand the difference or don't recognize the difference. The New York Times is of that opinion. The New York Times uses gender and sex interchangeably as the same word. This is something you typically see on the right, not the left. I almost can't believe it's an accident, because the New York Times is a left-wing paper, and they have someone on their staff like Sarah Jeong. Sarah Jeong was at The Verge. I have to assume the New York Times knows full well that there is a dictionary difference between gender and sex. For those that don't understand, and you don't have to agree, I'm just saying this is how it's defined typically among the left, and I believe the dictionary does have this distinction. Gender is the social constructs built around biological sex. Sex is whether you're male or female. It can be confusing because for the longest time people used gender and sex interchangeably. They did. The New York Times is doing that now, and thus protests and no one understanding what the hell is going on. Look at this tweet. The Trump administration's plan to define sex as determined strictly by genitals doesn't make sense medically or biologically. Except it does. To an extent, right? But it does. For like 99.7% of cases, it does. But now look at this, the story. Anatomy does not determine gender, experts say. These are two different things. Why is the New York Times, which is a left-leaning, somewhat, paper, using these terms interchangeably? What's happening is that people who see this tweet, they're planning to define sex as determined. Oh, okay. When the New York Times says the administration is planning to define sex as determined by genitals, they're using the word sex correctly. And they're also telling the story correctly, because according to the New York Times story, it wasn't about gender. The Trump administration was trying to define sex, not gender, okay? However, they say it this way so that they can then add, it doesn't make sense medically or biologically. This is ridiculous. It's so ridiculously fake what they're doing. My mind is blown by this. This is horrible, irresponsible journalism from the New York Times, because then the link actually says gender, not sex. Now let's look at the story, okay? Anatomy does not determine gender, experts say. Yes, there are many experts who will tell you that your gender is the social construct around your biological sex, and thus gender is a social construct. What they mean by that: when a man wears a suit, that is gendered. When a woman wears a dress, that is gendered. But the genitals, that is biological. Plain and simple. There is a difference. Now, yes, there are people who absolutely argue there is no biological sex, and those people, in my opinion, are wrong, and there's something wrong with you if you don't believe in objective reality, okay? In about 99, I think it might be like 98.3% of cases, I believe is the number, 98.3% of people will fall into XX or XY, and thus their characteristics will resemble those things rather closely. And there is nuance, right? What makes someone a man and a woman? There is some nuance in that some people might have a hormone imbalance. There are some women who are 6 foot tall, super strong, and flat chested. It's the characteristics that determine your biological sex vary. However, overwhelmingly, as I mentioned, like 98.3% of the time, even if there is a woman who is very, very masculine with a lot of testosterone, you can still typically tell what their biological sex is through outward characteristics, bone structure, height, etc. There's also the idea, for people who believe that there is no biological sex, they're wrong, and the best way to determine that is to simply tell people in a room to line up from tallest to shortest, and then you will see that it's mostly men on one side, they're taller, mostly women on the other side. It's just normal. There is biological sex. People can receive hormone treatment to change these things, but the idea of gender is just simply the social constructs around biological sex. And this can be, when you look at different cultures, you can see that, like, Look at Scotland, for instance, the kilt, right? In the U.S., that would be considered, a feminine quality, a woman trait, a female gender trait. In Scotland, it's not. To people in the U.S., it looks more like a dress or a skirt, but it's called a kilt. It's something different. So we look at this story from the New York Times. They've got everyone freaking out. They've got protests erupting. Why? Because they are using the more right-wing definition of what gender and sex mean interchangeably. And I kind of feel like it's on purpose, I'm not a conspiratorial person, but look, the New York Times knows what they're doing. Like, they understand these definitions. Can this be... So let's read what they say, because they actually dig into the idea of sex being not determined by genitals. They say, defining gender as a condition determined strictly by a person's genitals is based on a notion that doctors and scientists abandoned long ago as oversimplified and often medically meaningless. Researchers who have studied gender issues and provided health care to people who do not fit the typical MF pigeonholes said that the Trump administration's latest plan to define gender goes beyond the limits of scientific knowledge. Except, they didn't talk about gender at all. They're talking about biological sex. Please use the correct terms, New York Times. We're trying to better understand what's going on with the world. However, this story probably makes a lot more sense to conservatives who see sex and gender as interchangeable. The idea that a person's sex is determined by their anatomy at birth is not true. And we've known that it's not true for decades, said Dr. Joshua Safer, an endocrinologist and executive director of the Center for Transgender Medicine and Surgery at Mount Sinai Health System in New York. He is also president of the United States Professional Association of Transgender Health. This puts him in an extremely biased position where his beliefs are going to be based on the organization he's working for. Is he an expert? Yes. Does he know more than me? 100%. So I defer to him on many of these issues, but I do like to point out that while what he's saying is true, we do recognize that some people may be outwardly appearing female but have a chromosomal imbalance or hormonal imbalance in about 98.3% of cases. I believe it's about 1.7% of people will be intersexed or not, characterized by the overwhelming majority of the differences between, sex. So there's nuance to this argument, and there's also another thing that needs to be pointed out with this argument is that if a doctor immediately assumed somebody had a certain condition because of their outward appearance, that could be an issue. So it does make sense in many regards to make sure, especially in today's day and age, when a doctor is dealing with diseases or syndromes or whatever kind of health ailment that is typically associated with one gender or another, it's important that they know more than just the immediate assumption based on secondary or primary sexual characteristics. If we want to be efficient in healthcare. But exactly what does determine gender identity? A person's powerful core knowledge of who they are is not so clear. And here we have it. Here we have it. Let me just point out the New York Times published fake news. And what I mean by fake news is this is so incredibly deceptive. It is inept. It is wrong. They said, the plan to define sex as determined by genitals doesn't make sense medically or biologically. And the story says gender identity is not so clear. Okay, that's what they're doing here. Sure. We know there's a significant, durable biological underpinning to gender identity. Dr. Safer said, what we don't know are all of the biological factors at play that explain gender identity. As far as we in the mainstream biological medical community understand it in 2018, it is hardwired, it is biological, it is not entirely hormonal, and we do not have identified genes, so we cannot specifically say it's genetic. While I will defer to the experts, and I will accept the argument from a doctor, I will also point out there are other doctors who disagree. And I've done videos about it. This is one individual from an organization seeking, it's biased. They're biased towards transgender individuals. So they're of these beliefs, but it is not an absolute. Science never is. And I recently there was a study pulled down from a university talking about transgender being a social construct that was going viral because of the internet. This study was pulled down because of activist outcry. And the problem then arises with the sciences when we have people who believe that, it's transgender is biological, but the other argument being put forward with the actual research is being pulled down for political reasons. So here's my challenge to the expert. While I will say a doctor is going to know way more than I do for sure, and far be it from me to assume I know more than an actual medical doctor and somebody who's actually working on transgender health, I will point out you create doubt among people like me when activists demand research is pulled down for political reasons. Should I believe this person? I tend to defer to people who have a doctor in front of their name on specific issues because I don't, and I'm not going to assume I know more than they do. That would be absurd. However, I believe there's political forces at play that have resulted in some early research being done on the issue being pulled down. If we're not going to conduct science in a reasonable manner because of politics, I can't overly just trust this individual. So here's the thing. Like, I don't want to talk about this one particular story too much. The Trump administration, as my understanding, wants to define biological sex, specifically as based on your genitals. It's a political classification, not meant to be a medical classification. The reason for it is not too dissimilar as to why Congress was going to vote as to whether pizza was a vegetable. That's how the media portrayed it. What Congress was actually trying to determine was that if the tomato sauce in pizza was a serving size of a vegetable, that's the actual argument. That makes sense. If you eat a slice of pizza, there's tomato sauce on it. Will that qualify as one serving of vegetables? It's a specific political question for nutrition information, not to determine what doctors... And people said they're trying to ask whether pizza's a vegetable. They're crazy. Literally didn't happen. Is Trump defining gender? No, he's defining biological sex. So here's the thing. By all means, use the two interchangeably if you'd like, but gender is used among the left to refer to the social practices associated with your biological sex. And their argument is that there's no reason for that, and you can dress however you want, and many people do. And I understand that. It's a very easy argument to understand. And this is why when people talk about there only being two genders, the left and the right don't agree. Look, if you are born male or female, you can wear whatever clothes you want. And that's why... So part of the trouble comes when now we have forces on the left, like Nicholas Matt, for instance, who debated Jordan Peterson, arguing biological sex doesn't exist either. And that's factually incorrect. Men have denser bones, they have more muscle mass, they have double the collagen than women, and men are 98.3% of the time going to be the carriers of sperm, and women the carriers of eggs, and women produce babies, males produce sperm and females produce the babies. I want to differentiate between the language here. I don't know what else to say about this other than this story is really confusing. I don't know what the New York Times is trying to say because they're conflating gender and sex, but then in their own article, talking about gender identity, so it sounds like they know what they're talking about. This is garbage reporting from the New York Times, plain and simple. I can't even get a concise thought as to what's going on here because of how ridiculously bad the reporting from the New York Times is. So whatever. I got another story coming up in a few minutes, so just stick around and it'll be up.